Hi, this is Mr. Gideon. So now let's talk about trade. What's the purpose of trade? Well, to make yourself better off than you were before the trade, whether you're talking about an individual, a company, or an entire country. Let's take an example of two castaways now, each on their own separate individual islands, Tom and Hank. Get it? Tom, Hank's castaway. Anyway, so you got Tom on one island, Hank on the other island. And here's an example, hypothetical of course, of their production possibilities frontiers. Each one of these are straight line PP curves. If you take a look at Tom's situation, you notice that according to these numbers, if he goes to this extreme of coconut production, he can produce 30 units of coconuts. If he goes to the other extreme, he can produce 40 units of fish. For Hank, take a look at those extremes, and you get 20 for coconuts, 10 for fish. So we have this term that is absolute advantage, and it asks if you took all of your resources and put it to the extreme, and you compared that extreme to somebody else's extreme, another individual, Tom versus Hank, or two countries, let's say the United States and Canada, who would come out on top? Who could produce more? So the answer to the first question here, who has the absolute advantage in coconut production, obviously, is Tom. 30 beats 20. Who has the absolute advantage in fish production? If you look to that extreme, of course, Tom wins again, 40 to 10. So it seems like Tom's doing pretty well, at least when you compare his life to Hank. Why should Tom even think about trading with Hank? He has a better material life than Hank. He should specialize in trade because, through the magic of this theory, they'll both be even better off. And we can thank David Ricardo for this theory of specialization in trade. Now you might be asking, how in the heck, if Tom trades with Hank, is he going to be better off? Maybe I could see intuitively how Hank would be better off. Well, let's take a look at the numbers a little bit more closely. Look down here where it says Table 4.1. If you take a look at the column that focuses on Tom, and you think about opportunity cost, because we've covered this recently, there's no such thing as free. And wherever Tom or wherever Hank wants to be on their production possibilities frontiers, as they move further toward one extreme, they give up the opportunity to produce more of the other product. Using these numbers specifically, let's take a look at the numbers we're given and decide if the picture changes somewhat when we think in terms of opportunity cost. For Tom, according to the numbers we're just given in this chart, and you could actually later on have to calculate what the opportunity cost is, but in this example you wouldn't have enough information to calculate this on your own, you're just given it. For Tom, for one additional fish, in terms of production and moving closer to the fish extreme, it would cost him the opportunity to produce 3/4 of a coconut. So let's go back up here. Let's say you start at this point and you go closer to the direction of fish production in your Tom. What's it going to cost you for each additional fish that you produce? A lost opportunity of 3/4 of a coconut. Now, if you were going to go in the opposite direction and move this way, every time you went in that direction 1 unit and produced one more coconut, what's it going to cost you in terms of the opportunity you lose to produce a fish? More specifically, how much fish is it going to cost you as you go 1 unit at a time closer to that other extreme? Right, 4/3 fish, or 1 1/3 units of fish. Now let's take a look at Hank. Let's say you're starting at this point, and according to this first line here, we're going to think about the possibility of moving toward the extreme of fish, produce more fish. So we're here at this point on his PP curve, and for every unit we produce, one additional unit that we produce of fish, what are we giving up in terms of coconut production? 2 coconuts. That's correct. That's 2 coconuts we could have produced that we're no longer going to be able to produce because we're using our resources to increase fish production. What if we go back in the opposite direction? Every time we produce 1 more unit of coconuts, according to the information we're given here in this chart down below in Table 4.1, it's going to cost us, if we're Hank, a half a fish that we could have produced. So if that's the case, Does Tom have the advantage if you compare the opportunity he gives up in both areas, just like he had the advantage, or we'll be specific, just like he had the absolute advantage a minute ago? No. As a matter of fact, he's got an advantage in the production of one thing, comparatively, but not in the other. And for this reason, we're not that concerned in economics about absolute advantage. We're concerned with comparative advantage, also defined as the lower marginal opportunity cost, lower extra opportunity cost. Who has the lower extra opportunity cost when it comes to coconut production? In other words, as each of these guys, Tom and Hank, produce one extra coconut, who does it cost less to do that? That's right, Hank. Because it only costs him half a fish compared to 4/3 of a fish every time Hank wants to produce one more unit of coconuts. So now Hank wins in something. He wins in the comparative advantage of coconut production. If we scroll down a little bit further here, you see another question. Who has the comparative advantage, the lower extra opportunity cost, in terms of fish production? Well, Tom wins there, because if you compare these two things on the same line, in terms of fish production, to produce one more fish, it costs Tom 3/4 of an opportunity to produce a coconut, but Hank, it costs more. So Tom wins in that area. When you start to think about comparative advantage, or lower marginal opportunity cost, remember that if you're comparing two individuals like Tom and Hank, or you're comparing two countries, one of the two parties will never have a comparative advantage in both. One side will always win with one thing, and the other side will always win in the production of the other thing. So, if that's the case, maybe each guy should specialize in the thing they're better at producing and then trade with each other. Maybe. We'll show you an example of them being able to do that and end up being better in just a second, but let's define a couple of more terms. First of all, periods relevant to trade. Remember, we discussed this in a previous lesson. We're looking at PP curves. We're looking at a point in time where potential is today. So it's important to use time as part of this concept because in the future their potential could change, could expand if they grow, based on a number of factors we'll talk about later. So since time is important, understand that there is the time before the trade where they're thinking about making a trade, and that's called the ex ante position. After the trade is made, that's called the ex post position. Also, they're going to make a trade if they can come to terms of trade that are mutually beneficial. The terms of trade just mean exactly that. What are you going to give up in exchange for the thing you're trading for? Costs of trades are also important to understand, also known as transaction costs. Potential trade might not become an actual exchange if transaction costs are too high. So both sides are going to think about what the transaction cost might be, how much effort is it going to take, how much of their resources are they going to have to devote to making a trade take place. If you're talking about countries, of course, then these costs could include the cost of shipping, for example. So if the transaction costs aren't too high, and the two sides negotiate terms of trade that are good for both sides, they could each use their comparative advantage to mutual benefit. In other words, Tom could specialize in fish production, put all his resources into fish production because that's where he has a comparative advantage. And Hank could specialize in coconut production, put all of his resources into coconut production, and then they could trade some of what they produced for the thing that the other guy produced, and then, like magic, both could be better off. So I'm going to give you an example where we build on the previous PP curves and show them both being better off. In this case, you see the PP curve and the point on each of these curves that they were before they decided to trade. But what do you think the terms of trade were in this example? In other words, let's keep scrolling down, include a table. This is the portion of the table we had a minute ago, and for Tom, he was saying, okay, well, instead of trading, I could always just produce and consume 28 units of fish and 9 of coconuts. For Hank, I could just do my own thing and not deal with Tom and produce 6 units of fish to consume, as well as produce 8 units of coconuts to consume. But maybe I could be better off. Maybe we can both be better off if we specialize and trade. How? Well, if you haven't figured it out already, they have decided to trade because they thought about the fact that if they agreed to terms of trade that were 10 fish for 10 coconuts, they could both be better off. Well, how is that? You got to be kidding me, Mr. Gideon. Where are you getting those numbers from? Well, start from here and look at these 2 columns, because this is what would happen if they both decided to specialize in trade. Look above and you can see where the numbers come from. So Hank had this comparative advantage in the production of coconuts. So let's say he does that. He puts all of his resources, all of his eggs into one basket, so to speak. And he says, all right, I'm going to produce 20 coconuts. I'm not going to do any fish. I'm going to trade for the fish that I want. And then Tom says, fine, I'll specialize. I'll specialize in the production of fish because that's where my comparative advantage is compared to Hank. And if I do that, I'll get 40. You do that over there, Hank, with the coconuts. You can do 20. But we'll trade 10 for 10. Will both be better off than they would have been before? Sure. Because before, on this side, without trade, Tom could have consumed 28 fish. Now, if he puts all of his resources into producing fish and trades 10 away, he still can eat 30. That's better off than he was before. Plus, instead of 9 coconuts, he gets to consume 10, because that was part of the terms of trade. Hank also ends up better off. Instead of 6 and 8, he gets to consume 10 and 10 after specializing and producing coconuts and then trading 10 away. So with these numbers and plenty of other examples that we'll see in the future, more so with countries than individuals, you can see how specialization in trade, at least in theory, ceteris paribus, can make the 2 parties better off, regardless of who has the absolute advantage. Let's say in the case of countries, you have the United States with a straight line PP curve where they're trying to decide how much of the resources they want to devote towards production of aircraft versus the production of pork. And Canada is doing the same thing. Can you visualize how specialization in trade, as long as the terms of trade are acceptable to both sides, could end up making both countries better off? I hope so, because we'll be coming back to this in the future.